Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and good night to all you lovely folks joining me here nice and early over at Marvel's Snap Zone. Congratulations, welcome on in, it's finally global release day. We've been waiting for this time for, well, a long time, quite frankly. Beta testing been super successful, and we're super happy to see Marvel Snap finally available for everyone, including you, to play right now on Android, iOS, desktop, Steam, worldwide, everywhere, wherever you like on the go. It is now available for you to play, which makes this tier list arguably the most exciting one that we've had so far at any point. It's officially the first metagame, I guess, of the first season, and we're looking forward to kind of breaking down what we currently think is Tier 1, the best decks in the game, the kind of decks you should be aiming to build as you move into Pool 2 and Pool 3, if you want to be competitive inside of Marvel Snap. As always, if you want to see more content like this from us at SnapZone, well, first of all, we have a website. You can check that out in the description box below for all articles, deck lists, breakdowns, all kinds of wonderful goodies if you want to catch up with us over there. But if you haven't already, consider subscribing to us here on YouTube so we can know that we're doing something that's worth doing and be back with more Marvel Snap content in the near future. Click the bell, turn on notifications, and let me know how we're doing. If you've never been to one of our tier lists before, I'm going to show you on screen what we think the metagame looks like currently. If you want these deck lists for yourself, they are available in the article in the description down below. You can grab them, export them, import them into your client, play them as long as you've got the cards, easy as that. So give that a click, but you'll be able to see it on screen if all you want is a visual shot. What I'm going to do for you this week, however, I'm actually going to go through each and every one of the decks on this tier list and break down how it works and how it plays, because we're expecting a lot of new players to be joining us this week, and I want to do my best to try and describe a little bit of everything Marvel Snap if I can. We're also trying out a new layout this week when it comes to showcasing stuff on screen, so let me know what you think. Hopefully it's a bit clearer for you in terms of data. We want to thank all the sources of information that are used to create this tier list. So thank you to the guys over at Snapman and their community server on Discord for all their data and their community in general. Snapdecks on Twitter, also a fantastic place if you're looking for deck lists. Marvel Snap IO, and of course all the players who take the time to chat about their insight and their thoughts with us in our community Discord server or personally. So thank you for informing our decisions on this tier list as well. With all that said and done, let's finally take a look at the very first official season of Marvel Snap's weekly tier list. Okie dokie then. So, some pretty expected choices here on this week's metagame, and some that are a little more surprising, moving their way up or moving their way down. Definitely interesting to see the movements of the most recent patch continuing this week as we head into global release. So, the big three this time around, continuing to dominate the metagame. Sarah Miracle, to the surprise of no one. Sarah remains one of the most powerful cards in the game, doing some very, very silly things, joined by Destroyer and Patriot this week, making its way up into tier number 1. Tier 2 this week, looking pretty flush actually. Zero making its way down from its tier 1 position last week to just a little teeny bit lower in tier number 2. The Deadpool deck joining it as well. Lockjaw on reveal and Wong reveal, these on reveal strategies proving to be very powerful in this patch, finding themselves in tier 2 this week. And the control deck slowly being refined, card choices making more sense, moving itself up to tier number 2 this week as well. Tier 3, How the Mighty Have Fallen, negative serotonin, all the way down in tier 3 this week, alongside traditional Won't Going, the Dracula Discard deck, the Hella Sandman deck, the more unconventional discard deck to play, and Kazoo, everyone's favourite linear aggro deck, also finding itself in tier 3 this week. Tier number 4, finally, to the want of many, the bounce deck, making its way onto the tier list, continuing to improve and continuing to look even better as this format shakes itself out. Movement making an appearance at tier 4 this week, and the original Mr. Negative deck all the way down at the bottom of tier 4. Again, How the Mighty Have Fallen since that most recent buff and nerf patch. Budget options still available for you on this tier list as well. If you are looking for stuff that is mostly Pool 2 centric, missing a lot of Pool 3 cards, there will be some options for you to try out and import at the bottom of the article, so go and give those a click. Alright, hopefully this all works. Let's take our time to look at some of these deck lists, some example deck lists, and kind of explain to you how they work and what you should be looking for if you find yourself playing with or against these decks. Okie dokie. So starting with the big cheese, the kingpin of Marvel Snap, arguably the best deck in the game for, well, quite some time now, and definitely since the patch. Serra, a week has passed, and the counters to Serra Miracle are starting to emerge, but the deck is managing to widen that gap between itself and the rest of the competition as it gets more refined. Now, the win rate is not outrageous by any stretch, but the ability the deck has to just develop absolutely absurd amounts of stats on turn 6 make it a great deck for racking up chunks of cubes. Another great upside of this deck is just the flexibility, because playing Serra on turn 5 just allows you to make play patterns that you couldn't make without it. It turns out reducing the cost of cards is really, really strong. So finding yourself in positions where suddenly there are chunks of power on the board because you've managed to stack Angela, Colleen Wing, Mojo, Ant-Man, Star-Lord all in the same turn. Very, very, very strong, and continues to just be the highest level performer in the entire game so far. If you're looking for innovative takes on Serra and just explanations of the build in general, there's a whole write-up and deck guide from our lovely writer Kanye Best available on the website as well. You can go check that out. Links to the tier list. If you are not familiar with how to play this one, as you might have guessed from the name, very much looking to capitalize on the ability of Serra to reduce the cost of every card in your hand by 1, to create a very spectacular turn 6. There are definitely chunks of cards that can be played before Serra on turn 5, things like Bishop, things like Angela. They're very flexible and can be utilized very early, but by holding on to them, you can also spread your points very efficiently on the final turn of the game, allowing you to kind of surprise your opponent in spots where maybe you wouldn't be able to, and gather tons of information about what they're trying to do. That's what makes Serra Miracle such a powerful deck in raking those cubes in if you're looking to ladder up. Not a lot of change here. Deck is still fantastic. Do not see it going anywhere anytime soon outside of a Serra nerf. Your other tier 1 options this week, we've got Destroyer. Destroyer, for the longest of time, kind of dwindled in tier 3, tier 2 of our tier lists. Very much a mainstay of the game now as the lists have become refined, more people are playing it, and it definitely just kind of lets you rake in those cubes with updated pieces of interaction. While it's never going to reach, like, 60-point locations in a game, Destroyer's stability is just outstanding. It features a really nice mixture of disrupting your opponent with cards like Green Goblin, sometimes even things like Killmonger, especially Hobgoblin filling up their locations with random crap. You've got a lot of variants of this deck playing Debris, which fill up even more of your opponent's locations with rocks that they don't want anything to do with. And it's just really good at having this kind of like paired next to the destroy mechanic, so you can destroy your own rocks, you can Killmonger your own rocks, carnage them out of the way to make more space, and trigger things like Bucky Barnes. This deck is kind of a known quantity at this point. You are very much built around the idea of Destroyer. You're going to be looking to focus on 2 locations, just 2 locations with a deck like this, because you're playing a card like Warpath, which is going to benefit from having a completely empty location, which is kind of what you want. You can contest the 3rd location with cards like Green Goblin and Hobgoblin if you want to, but you do not have to. Destroyer's effect, you're going to play cards onto the 3rd location and just expect to get them wiped out and juke people with Warpath and suddenly unveil a huge location as well. For the locations that you want to compete on, you're going to be looking to set up a number of cards, usually things like Armor or Cosmo if they're in your lists, to kind of turn off the Destroyer on-hit ability. We're going to be looking to play Armor or any card that we don't want to see destroyed on one location. Warpath and Demon, often going to be big point scorers. The Demon from the Hood. On these locations you want to try and protect. And on the other location you want to be playing your Bucky Barnes, your Nova, these Colossus, things you either can't destroy or do want to destroy. So they all trigger when you play Destroyer on the final turn of the game. Really sweet deck, a very known, powerful quantity. And looking forward to seeing whether it can hold its reign at the top of Tier 1 as we go forward in Marvel Snap's lifetime. The other Tier 1 deck this week, a new inclusion, just very much having found its groove, Patriot. Patriot, a very strong deck that's utilising the namesake card, duplicating its effect courtesy of Onslaught or Mystique to just super bump the stats of anything that did not have any abilities, which is what Patriot is all about. Outside the deck's natural ability to produce chunks of points, it's now got a lot of added upside by not caring about opposing debris, because the rocks are actually good for you. They get buffed by Patriot, which is some fantastic counterplay that a lot of other decks just don't have access to. meaning they get disrupted by something like debris much more easily. Otherwise, Patriot just fits the bill in terms of surprising the opponent with the amount of points you can develop on the last turn of the game, alongside being able to impact every location, even if you're not playing directly to it. Very much revolves around those payoff cards to buff the whole board. There'll be Patriot and Mystique, that combination together, or things like Kazoo, Blue Marvel. They all serve as like decent Patriot replacements in a pinch, but Patriot should definitely be the go-to option if you've got it. Onslaught and Mystique duplicating that ability. You find some versions of this list still play Magic to get that extra draw step if required, or even things like Adam Warlock to try and get a little deeper into the deck and guarantee you draw Patriot and the namesake cards for this strategy. The rest of the deck very much composed of cheap recipients for buffs, should be used to fill 2 locations before you kind of like focus on your combo turn or in the last few turns somewhere. You're going to need the 3rd location to play your payoffs so that you're maximizing stats on the 2 locations you want to win. But Ultron here at the top end of this list does offer you a different path to victory, as that card can just fill 2 locations all by itself and let you have like very passive turns in the early game. Very much a deck that's finding its groove, a very popular choice among beta players as well. Looking forward to seeing whether Patriot or not can retain its grip on the top of the metagame. We move down into tier number 2, going to take a look at some of the options that are down here. Kind of as expected, the Zero archetype suffered a bit of a setback from its like very hot start last week. But it still looks like a great deck, honestly. It's worth noting the deck is definitely adapting. Various versions of Zero have emerged. The archetype might still have some tricks up its sleeve that we haven't figured out just yet. There are some people, which we'll show a list for in just a moment, trying out Sarah in this archetype, because she impacts the whole build quite a lot to kind of create this hybrid between Zero and Sarah Miracle. This deck is built around the negative abilities of Typhoid Mary and Red Skull and negating them as much as you can. But it mixes several other synergies in there. We tend to see a lot of these lists playing the Destroy cards, the common Destroy package of Carnage, Venom, Bucky Barnes, and then cards that remove the abilities of Typhoid Mary and Red Skull, such as Zero, or Enchantress being played after those cards. Kind of favours Enchantress where possible, because you can surprise your opponent with a chunk of points they weren't expecting to see on a location by removing that negative effect after you've played the card as well. The upside of kind of decks like this is your minions are just so large. Typhoid Mary and Red Skull have so much amazing stats, which means you can play cards like Taskmaster to really like duplicate them and make another copy on the final turns of the game. Or some of these lists play cards like Arnim Zola to split it down the middle and create 2 copies of a big statted minion on the final turn of the game. As a result, the deck can often play very similarly to the Destroy archetypes. Right up until turn 4, you're going to be setting up these Novas and Bucky Barnes and Sabertooths and Mysterios. And then in the late game, you're going to be chunking down these big point scorers and looking for play patterns that are going to maximize those points and minimize downsides that are on those point scorers. While Zero definitely needs to be played before, you know, Taskmaster, Venom, Enchantress, these are all things that can come afterwards to give like big surprise turn 6s. The bonus list I was talking about is just going to be on screen for you here for Sarah Zero real quick, where people are mixing this list together with Sarah. But if you want this list from the Snap fan community, you can go and grab it in the article down below if you want to take a closer look at this one. However, up next, Deadpool, a fan favourite. Honestly, Deadpool. Mostly because it's just a favourite hero character for a lot of people. Wave and Sarah have a very strong relationship in Marvel Snap, and the more popular Sarah gets, the more enticing Wave gets, because there is so much natural counterplay to Sarah as a card courtesy of Wave. Playing Wave on turn 5 alongside a thing like Sandman can often be the best counter in the game to Sarah turns, which is why you see some of these decks picking up in popularity. No Sandman in this version of Deathpool, but it's very much utilising a very well-known synergy between Death and Wave. In this case, if you're unfamiliar, Death is a 9 cost card that has its cost reduced by 1 for every card that's been destroyed during the game, but that reduction applies on top of Wave's ability to make everything cost 4 on the following turn. So you can quite often have 0 powered deaths alongside Taskmaster or Venoms and stuff in the end game of the end games of the game. to have these really explosive final turns, reduced by wave, while making your opponent unable to be explosive because all their stuff costs 4. Destroy mechanic just looking very, very strong in general. Cards like Taskmaster also shining in this deck. They play very well with Venom and Death, and even Deadpool in this case, because Deadpool is just like a fantastic payoff for an archetype like this. You're looking to destroy it as many times as you can, courtesy of cards like, again, common inclusions here, Venom, Killmonger, Carnage, your normally expected destroy effects. Deadpool playing very, very well with Hulkbuster as a way to kind of suddenly have 5 stats doubled into 10 as opposed to 1 stats doubled into 2. Which is very, very cool, and leads to some really sick blowouts with tasks like Deadpool Taskmaster on the final turn of the game to just add chunks of points onto locations in the final turn of the game. Venom, definitely the flexible option here. Very much another destroy tool for the most part, or like another big target for Taskmaster, but easily the card that we don't see included the most currently. Really sweet deck. Cool to see it back on top, honestly. It had a few weeks where it was really kind of struggling. The Lockjaw on reveal deck, it's time for us to kind of talk about, I guess, the big winner this week in terms of the tier list. And these are these on reveal strategies, this one and a few others that we'll get into in a little bit. But the first one, kind of the most well-known strategy in terms of on reveal stuff, the Lockjaw deck. Looks like it's found its core and like found its 12 cards that it wants to play, and is now like kind of moving a few cards here and there and adapting to popular opponents, but that's about it. Wave a new inclusion to this deck currently because, again, just so good into these Sarah turns and kind of makes itself look great alongside things like Doctor Doom, Magneto, very, very strong. But as a result, we didn't find ourselves cutting America Chavez because we want to be able to draw our 6-cost cards early so they play well with Wave. If you are, however, set on having America Chavez back in this deck for like Jubilee plays or final turn of the game, we could definitely see something like Green Goblin being the card that you can afford to lose. Plan A of this deck, very straightforward. Play Lockjaw, play cheap things on the location Lockjaw is on. Have it turn into powerful on reveal units with big, big stats if you can. However, there are some backup plans for a deck like this. Through things like Thor, Jubilee, and Odin, it's possible to just develop large amounts of stats on 2 locations and never be forced to retreat when you don't draw Lockjaw, courtesy of Mjolnir just like supercharging Thor on a certain location. Other versions of this deck are playing cards like Psylocke to like accelerate into early Doctor Dooms, to be able to make plays like Doctor Doom into Odin, for example, which this list you see on screen can't currently facilitate as it's playing some different early game options and Wave. But with Wave now added into the mix, the deck can also just be super disruptive. It can do the whole Wave on turn 4, Odin on turn 5 to trigger Wave again, play pattern that we see out of so many previous Wave Odin decks in the past, to stop your opponents playing out multiple cards on those final 2 turns of the game, which is a very, very strong play pattern right now, allowing to a lot of success for the Lockjaw on reveal deck. Definitely worth trying out if you have access to the cards for it. The other big winner, Wong Reveal, a deck I'm not actually sure we've covered on the tier list before. We kind of mentioned it briefly last week following the patch notes in the Wong Going part of last week's tier list. This is often referred to as the Exodia deck if you're new to Snap. At least it was in the first few seasons of Marvel Snap. And it's looking to just kind of solidify its position heading into the Season 5's metagame. This isn't really aimed at countering anything in particular, but it just arguably at this point has the most ridiculous turn 6s you can have, but it requires a lot of setup to get there, courtesy of Wong putting your on reveal effects just supercharged on steroids. It's really flexible, honestly. You can include current popular tech cards, things like Green Goblin, Debris, Carnage to cancel out your opponent's copies of those cards. Arguably at the moment the most questionable card in this deck is Ebony Maw. And definitely should be the first cut if you find something you want to play instead, in my opinion. Considering you normally get to play onto the same location for at least 3 turns until you find Wong, Ebony Maw's ongoing effect actually can be a little bit of a problem for you. But it is a very, very solid stat stick, so definitely worth considering. For the most part, you're going to be wanting to leverage Wong's ongoing ability here to just maximize your on-reveal effects. During the first 3 turns of the game, you just want to be disruptive. Play your cards like Black Widow, Scorpion, Debris, Green Goblin. Annoy your opponent, stifle their development, then turn 4, Wong, as often as you can, as consistently as you can. You just want to jam it onto an empty location where possible, or at the very worst, one with 2 spaces. You then want to go turn 5, something like White Tiger for additional power. on the Wong location, or things like Hazmat plus Ironheart, so you can nuke all your opponent's units and supercharge all of yours. You could do things like Hazmat into Carnage, so Carnage clears the negative stuff on your side. Or even things just like Carnage Ironheart to clear out annoying units that your opponent has given you on this turn 5. However, for the most part, turn 6, very often going to be Odin on Wong's location, just re-trigger all these on-reveal effects 4 times, which is absurd, if we're being completely honest. If you don't have it, you can try and bluff it too, which is very, very cool. If you snap on turn 6, a lot of people are going to have to respect Odin and make sure they can beat it if they want to continue to play the game. There are definitely versions of this list playing Mystique that go all in on duplicating Wong as many times as it can as well, and that can lead to some truly, truly absurd board states. So yeah, for sure, worth checking this one out if you haven't had the ability to do so in the past. But yeah, absolutely love it, and highly recommend it where possible. Okay, so going to be moving on to Control. Now, this is a deck that I'm actually super, super excited to talk about. Apologies for the error message there real quick. Computer is not having the best of days. Actually, super excited to talk about this deck. It's a deck we kind of covered briefly last week, kind of talking about the evolutions of the Magic Destroy archetype that had kind of been left behind by Magic's nerf, and people kind of figuring out what a deck should look like if they wanted to disrupt and react to your opponent's plays with like specific counter strategies. And it looks like this Control deck is solidifying itself in the metagame and figuring out what it wants to do. This is mostly focused on beating Sarah Miracle. You're going to be wanting to lock down locations, snipe Sarah with Enchantress. Things like this and Sandwave definitely have game into Sarah Miracle, but this deck seems to have a better overall cube gain rate, as opponents don't instantly retreat to specific cards like they do Sandman, for example. This deck really just wants to play cards every turn, but always in the spirit of how are you going to annoy your opponent the most. The core of the deck very much centered around limiting what they can do. You're not going to need these big 50-point locations to win games with a deck like this. Turn 1 and turn 2, very replaceable, bit careless, honestly. You can set up things like Nova to destroy, Angela for stats. Turn 3 and 4 are really where you need to make your tough choices. You can go the lockdown route and start storming and Spider-Manning locations to only leave one location for your opponent to attempt to play to. Sometimes, if they're playing Sarah, you can even snipe that location with Enchantress. You can try and flood the board with things like Mysterio, Debris, and Doctor Doom, planning to use Blue Marvel on the last turn of the game to like juice up the stats on all these cards. Or you can just try and fight for points, honestly, with things like Angela, Storm into Spider-Man locking down locations. So you can like develop points in spots where your opponent can't, is very much the plan with a deck like this. Once you pick your path to victory, turn 5 and 6 very much follow one of those 2 plans accordingly, which is kind of great, honestly. It's really cool to see this deck not dead and buried. People were very worried about the ability to play a control strategy after the most recent chunk of nerfs, and it seems kind of unfounded, honestly. So very, very cool to see Control thriving as it is currently in tier number 2. We'll move on to tier 3 and show you some of the options that are way down here, some alternatives for you. The king is dead. Long live the king, I suppose. Sarah and Miracle dominating the fray. Negative serotonin falling off significantly. These nerfs to Magic and Mr. Negative just really pulling down the overall power level of a deck like this. But it is still able to play some incredibly strong play patterns. If you can land Mr. Negative on 4 into Sarah on 5. It's just a little harder to do that with consistency. But it might actually boost this deck's cube average, honestly, because some people don't take the ceiling so seriously anymore and snap against you, heading into turn 4, not realizing they might already just be completely doomed, which is kind of crazy. Functionally, this list plays the same way it always has. Magic can still be a consideration in these lists. It's in the one that we're showing you now. But it's falling off given how valuable cards drawn from Mr. Negative are, because this deck is just more about high rolling now than it is about flexibility more than anything else. The big difference compared to this deck's glory days is it has like a go-to curve. The curve now used to be Negative on 4, Sarah on 5, Magic on 6. Now it has to be, Magic on 5, Sarah on 6, if you have both in hand. It's not quite as clean. It's definitely a little bit more awkward. And now that Mr. Negative has -1 power, he's not just an auto play anymore. if your best targets for his effect are already in your hand, things like Iron Man, sometimes you don't want to play Mr. Negative anymore, which is kind of crazy. Requires a more disciplined approach, honestly, to get the best out of this deck, and there are just kind of better options available. It seems like a lot of people are switching off of this deck and moving to other archetypes, but the raw power level and the ceiling of a deck like this keeps it very viable and is keeping it on the tier list for now. Wong Going is a well-established archetype at this point, but unfortunately for it, with so many decks playing Enchantress these days to turn off their own Red Skulls or snipe the opponent's Serra, Wong Going suffers collateral damage as a result of a tech choice like that. Wong also now featured alongside the On Reveal synergies, and that deck is putting up better results at the moment, so more and more people are moving away from Wong Going because the play patterns can be quite similar. That being said, very easy game plan on this one. Play Wong on turn 4, Mystique on turn 5, copy that ability, Spectrum on turn 6, buff all these ongoing cards you've played on turn 1, 2, and 3. Apart from those key cards, the rest of the deck is very much all about just cheap ongoing cards looking to receive Spectrum's buff, and for the most part they are very replaceable. This deck very much good at hiding its late game burst, so some opponents just won't realise their incoming demise and will not retreat, which means you can score yourself more cubes than some other decks. Very linear, very simple, but definitely the least popular of the Wong decks currently, courtesy of Enchantress and the On Reveal decks, one way or the other. Dracula Discard. Another one that was in a difficult position last week, honestly. And the synergy just hasn't really seemed to improve over time, but there is still reasons to just discuss this deck. Invisible Woman, just a card that is just very, very interesting and creates silly play patterns in this deck, and one that we're going to talk about in a minute as well when it comes to the Hela decks. It replaces things like Swarm and Mojo for some players in a deck like this. We're not sure it saves the archetype, but it's just an interesting enough addition to continue to talk about this deck's evolution and see it putting up some minor results. We still have some doubts about Wong, and Den considers things like Magic maybe a fitting replacement for a deck like this, to give you that extra draw to find Apocalypse, because at the moment you really do need to find Apocalypse to have the big endgame turns this deck is looking to have. But for now, Wong is getting played as nice disruption alongside cards like Moon Knight, to rip cards out of your opponent's hand. Unsurprisingly, Serra also a consideration for this deck, but that very much pushes it more towards explosive turn 6s, and this list as it's built right now very much looking to play on curve as best it can over the course of a game. Yeah, very much an Apocalypse-based deck here, looking to gain chunks of stats on Dracula on that final turn of the game, and just chunks of stats on cards like Morbius and Angela during the game, courtesy of a variety of discard effects. The play patterns for this deck very much depend on the hand, and mostly on your turn 2 play. Morbius is like the least committal play, simply pushes you to discard later as you go. It tends to benefit a ton from Wong duplicating discards later if it's already in play. Angela is very much the tempo-orientated play, and the Invisible Woman is the bad hand savior, if you like. Lets you play discards on her location even if you don't have Apocalypse, so that you can afford to use those discards on Apocalypse on the final turn of the game, which is very, very strong. Based on how you start the game, the only really rigid turn is turn 4. You're going to be looking to play Dracula if you have it, or looking to play Wong if you have chunks of discard cards to use. Really simple deck, very much falling off right now. Hopefully it can stabilize a little bit moving forward. Hela Sandman, the other deck we were going to talk about discussing Invisible Woman in just a moment. Very much like the deck before, it kind of looks like it needs a bit of help to perform at the moment. And that help might be here in the form of Sandman. The card's just really good at annoying all these Serra-based decks, and you don't care about it one bit. Hela gives absolutely zero craps about Sandman, as it's completely fine just playing one card a turn on turn 5 and turn 6. Hela does have problems with Debris and Green Goblin, clogging up your locations, especially if they clog up your Invisible Woman location, because that can sometimes just stop your entire play pattern from happening the way that you want it to happen. Sandman doesn't really change the way this deck plays. You're very much looking to have alternative turn 4s more than anything else. But the core of the strategy is very simple. Invisible Woman on a location, hide discard effects behind it. Turn 6, play Hela on the Invisible Woman location. Discard, flip Hela, revive all the things you discarded, courtesy of Hela's ability. Really simple, very strong, arguably quite high-rolly. But yeah, needs some help in a consistency boost at the moment. Very much struggling on the ladder as things currently stand. last but not least, we're going to take a look at everyone's favourite aggro deck, the best budget deck in the game, still hanging on our tier list, but definitely suffering a little bit as other decks start to improve as time goes on. Kazoo was really great last week, but its simplicity kind of came back to haunt it, and has had very little room to adapt or improve or progress in any way. Basically because most of its cards kind of tied early to the game, but with chunks of new players coming this week, Kazoo's going to be welcoming tons of new players this week, because it is easily the easiest way to get into competitive Snap, as it's just the lightest on pool 3 cards, honestly. Kazoo's the textbook proactive deck, looking to make smart use of its energy and play cards as much as it can. Big emphasis on payoff cards for a deck like this. Angela, Kazaa, Blue Marble, you want to be maximising their impact to represent your main win condition. But this version of the deck has some disruptive elements to give it a different angle, looking to limit what the opponent can do and develop your side of locations at the same time. So your go-to curve in the late game often going to be Kazaa into Blue Marble into Onslaught, which means that your first 3 turns can be filled with dorks and units to get buffs, or disrupting your opponent with things, again, like Green Goblin, Debris, these common inclusions for disrupting your opponent in this current format. Otherwise, you can be very flexible with your curve, and still focus on being energy efficient, which is very, very sweet. So yeah, Sarah, still looking to be a bit of a meta-defining card, but the question is to what degree. We're answering her as best we can. Cards like Enchantress picking up in popularity, locking down locations. Things like Sandman, stopping your opponent from playing too many cards in the same turn. But the current progression is very capable of dominating the game in the same way that we've seen before. But the rest of the metagame seems super enjoyable. The Destroy synergies against the disruptive cards is a really fun battle to have with people. On reveal synergies doing well means that your combo deck aficionados, they can get their fix, which is very, very cool. And this metagame feels like a really good one for global release to kind of happen in, which is very nice. And I can't wait to see the game grow and welcome tons of new players to the community. If you want to discuss this tier list or this article with the team, feel free to join our community Discord for all things Marvel Snap. You can check it out in the description box below. Come say hi, let me know what you think all around. You can also find me directly on Twitter if you like, at HowlingMines. And of course, one final time, if you haven't already, consider subscribing to the channel. I want to see you again, and I want to play Marvel Snap with you, so you can emote at me every time you take cubes from me in a game that I should have won. Until next time, folks, we'll be doing this again next week to see how things have evolved once we have chunks of new players. But I've been HowlingMines, you've been amazing, this has been Marvel Snap Zone. Have a good one.